What's up everybody, it's Bob from Garage Dwellers Woodworking. In today's video we are going to do a little woodworking 101. We're going to talk about the basics of panel glue ups, or better titled, how to make a tabletop. So let's go. So this is the first video in a series of what I'm going to call Woodworking 101, and I don't claim to be an expert on a lot of this stuff. However, there's a lot of things that I have learned over time that I want to share with people who are new to woodworking so that you don't make the same mistakes that I made. And one of the first things that I wanted to talk about was how to glue up a panel, which is essentially the same thing as how to make a tabletop, right? We're going to take these rough cut boards, we're going to mill them down to what we want. We're going to talk about picking your grain, how you align the boards, all that different stuff, how you join them, and ultimately how to make your tabletop the best it can be. So the first step, as in any woodworking operation, is milling. But before we take these to the joiner and the planer, the bandsaw, or whatever else we need to do, we need to think about a few things first. First things first, we need to do, unfortunately, a little bit of math and think about a little bit of layout. Now the ultimate tabletop that I need here is going to be 36 inches wide. I've got these 5 curly cherry boards, and I've currently got 4 feet worth of boards. So with all these, I want to think about cutting them down. Now I said I wanted to get 36 inches out. I've got 5 boards. So if I do about 7 1/4 inches on each board, that'll get me to 36 1/4 inches in the final piece. And then that leaves us a little bit of wiggle room. We can trim 1/8 of an inch off of either side later. That's not a big deal. The first thing we want to think about though then is, where do we cut these, right? Because in my ultimate layout of my board, I want to make sure that I've got good grain alignment. So as I look at the grain of this board in particular, you'll notice that we've got straighter grain here on the outsides. And then on the inside, I've got these cathedrals, right? Or I've got this sort of more exciting kind of wild topographic type grain where I've got circles, I've got a little peak up here, straight grain on the outside. Now, when I'm joining boards, if I have straight grain next to straight grain, it's going to be a little easier to make these joints seamless looking. So what I will make sure I avoid is I don't want to cut anything right down the middle of this, right? Because if I have open grain in the middle of one of these sort of topographic patterns that's butted up right next against straight grain, that's not going to look as good, and it's going to be a really obvious joint. We're going to try to finesse that a little bit more. Now the other thing that you got to consider, I don't have sapwood in any of the tops. These are going to be the show faces, I think, of all these boards, although maybe the bottoms. But I want to think about sapwood too. Some people like having sapwood in their tabletops. Now as I've flipped over this board, I've actually got a little bit of sapwood on both sides, right? So I've got the heartwood here in the center, which is the color of the wood itself. So right, this is what we think of when we think of cherry. The sapwood is always going to be the light wood compared to the heartwood. So I've got sapwood up here, I've got sapwood up here, and when I look at my measurement here, I've got at least 8 inches of heartwood throughout this. Even at my narrowest point, I've got about 8 inches. So I should be good to go on all these boards. The other thing that you're going to want to think about, so if we look at this, there's definitely some sapwood down here. This board also, when it was cut at the mill, went in a little bit that way. We've lost some there. So we're going to want to make sure that we cut any of these defects off so that we've got a nice straight edge to go up against. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do this, and if you don't have a bandsaw, that's totally fine. We talked about the table saw option. There's definitely a little bit more risk in that, again, because these are rough boards. Running it through it, there's going to be more potential for pinching. The bottom is not going to be totally flat, so the board can be moving on you, and that's always a dangerous situation with the table saw. If you don't have a bandsaw, what I would say instead is consider a track saw, a circular saw, or a jigsaw. The circular saw and the jigsaw, you grab a straight edge, you lay the straight edge, and then you use your circular saw or jigsaw to do your rip cut. Same thing with the track saw, right? I can lay my track out and I can run a rip cut that way. So you've got a ton of options how to do this. But for this, for each of these boards, I have to take a little bit off of each side. So what we're going to do is head to the bandsaw. We're going to make those rough cuts. Now I said I wanted my final boards to be 7 1/4. I don't want to cut it to 7 1/4 width at the bandsaw though. I want a little bit of wiggle room because I still have to joint these boards, and I still have to probably, joint them, plane them, and then probably take them to the table saw to run them through to get that kind of close to final width. All right, so I got these milled down to about 8 inches width. So next step, gonna get these jointed, join a face, join an edge at 90, then we'll take them to the planer, then the table saw to get them to the final width that we want them to be. And then it's time to start playing with layout. Now, if you don't have access to a joiner and a planer, there's a lot of ways to get milled lumber. Most places where you're going to buy your rough stock are going to be able to do some of that milling for you. In a future video, I'm going to explain all the different terms, but you can buy lumber that is milled on one face and one edge, all the way up to lumber that is completely milled to your specifications. Additionally, there's a lot of tools around the shop that you may have access to or that you may know someone who has access to that could do some of this mill work for you. So we'll talk about milling in separate Woodworking 101 videos. Now, for those of you that do have access to a joiner and a planer, what I like to do is start at the joiner by joining a face. And I like to take shallow passes personally. I just like to take a little less material off at each time until I get a nice flat bottom surface. I can then take that bottom surface that I just jointed, that face that I just jointed, and I can put that up against the fence, and that will get me what is essentially S2S lumber. So this stands for surfaced two sides, and for this it means that I've got one face and one adjoining edge that are already milled up and ready to go for further milling operations. Once I've accomplished this, I'm not going to joint the other edge. I'm going to go over to the planer next. Now at the planer, I do not have a specific thickness that I'm necessarily going for here. The lumber that I bought for this is 5/4. If you don't know what that means, lumber comes in quarter-based measurements, and so 5/4 is 1 1/4 inches thick. So the planer is using the flat face that I just did at the joiner and using that as a reference surface to then mill a parallel face that is going to give me a nice even thickness throughout the board. For these boards, I'm basically just trying to get a nice clean surface while maintaining as much thickness as possible. So again, I'm taking nice light passes here. I'm not doing anything too crazy. I want to maintain as much thickness as possible. If you have a specific thickness at this point that you're going for, that's obviously what you would be shooting for at this point. So the planer, the joiner get us to an S3S board that's going to be surfaced on 3 sides. And now the last question is, how wide do we want this thing to be? Let's talk about that. Hey, you're still here. Cool. So check it out. We're through the rough milling process, right? We've got everything cut to a very rough width that is still not our final width that we're going to use at glue up. One edge is jointed, so that's why these joints are not aligning together, because we only have one edge on each board jointed. A face has been jointed, and then we planed the other face parallel and got all of the rough lumber off. So now we're in a state where we can start to analyze this and just make sure we're good with everything. I just like to bring my top over and look at it and make sure it is making sense to me and that I like it and that I've still got a little bit of wiggle room where if I want to, for instance, cut more off in one spot than another, I can still do that because I've got at least a half, maybe even more than that, a half to 5/8 really that I can cut off of this, because the goal is to get these down to about 7 1/4 at that final width or somewhere close to it. So everything looks pretty good. There is something to consider as we lay this out, and let me show that to you right now. All right, so let's talk about our wood grain a little bit. We really need to pay attention to this. What I've done is I've taken a Sharpie here and I have drawn out how the grain of all this is going. All of these right now have the cup of the grain pointing upwards towards the ceiling. The conventional wisdom in gluing up tabletops or gluing up panels is that I don't want them all like this. Part of the reason for that is every one of these had cupped and had deformed in the same direction. All of these, when I took these over to the joiner, were bowed like this. So the bow was pointing down, so when I joined it, wood was taken off of the sides first and not the middle. Logic would indicate that if I glue these all up in the same direction as I have them now, and they all had that same shape deformity, that if this top over time were to cup or bow, then it would all now do it in the same direction and exaggerate it. So across the whole thing, you would get one big cup or bow like that. So traditionally, what you are told to do, and what I always learned, was that we should try to flip these around. So now, as we look at this, the grain direction is alternating. So my cup is down, cups up, cups down, cups up, cups down. The idea being that then if this tabletop, if each of these things deformed in its own way, because I've alternated that top, it kind of cancels itself out and it keeps the top of it flat. In actual practice, there is a lot of debate about this. Generally speaking, I try to do this because, again, it's what I was taught. At the same time, there are some woodworkers that argue, and I've seen plenty of folks on YouTube argue, that they would rather everything cup or bow in one direction versus having a table that, let's say, each individual piece of the panel started to cup or bow. In theory, you'd get this kind of wavy thing kind of going on there. I point this out because, again, this is traditional woodworking, teaches us that we alternate the pattern of the grain on the end grain here so that in theory you can keep a more flat panel. So the next step for me is going to be to take this over to the table saw, and I'm going to cut this down to what is going to be as close to final width as possible, leaving me wiggle room for one more joining activity. All right, now generally speaking, if you've done a good job and been careful with your joining and with your table saw work and you've got a good blade in there, you can see some of these joints are actually good to go. And to be honest, if I wasn't doing this video, I would most likely go ahead and proceed to glue at this point because I think this all looks pretty good. This being a Woodworking 101 video, I want to make sure that you guys know what to do if the results you get at first pass are not quite this good. And I can tell you, this is not how my first bunch of tables and panel glue ups went. They did not have a nice seam like this straight off the table saw. In fact, I had a lot of issues that I want to show you guys how to fix. What I'm going to do is go across and mark all these now. I'm going to mark 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I have marked them in the way that I can read them so that I know which orientation to put them in. And I've also made a couple of these marks so that as I span across the joint, I know again which of these go together. This is going to be really important here in just a second. You'll see why. Now you may have noticed that at no point have I checked my joiner to see if it's 90. And there's a reason for that. Joiner fences are really hard oftentimes to get to perfectly 90. So I'm not relying on all these joints to be at a perfect 90. What I'm relying on them to be is complementary. So let me show you what I mean by that. All right, so let's take a look at the end of our boards here one more time. So let's say, and we'll just exaggerate this, that my joiner is really off and that I reference the top face up against the fence. It's out of 90, and so instead of getting a perfect 90-degree cut on the joiner, it cuts something like this. And that much gets taken off and this angle happens. Well, what I then want to do is take this next piece and make a complementary angle. So if this piece is also cut in the same direction and that much gets out of there, when I join these two pieces together, it's going to make the top 180 degrees. And that's what I'm worried about. I'm not worried about both of these boards being perfectly 90 at this intersection. I'm worried about the top being 180 degrees and perfectly flat. So how do we do that? How do we get the same cut if my joiner is out of whack? Well, all I have to do, fold them like a book. So I've got board 1, I've got board 2. I'm going to fold them up. That's the joint where they meet, and as you can see now, I'm going to be getting the same angle cut on the joiner. Now at this stage, what if you don't have a joiner? Well, again, there's the same options that we had before. We can set a router table up to give you a jointed edge. You can use a track saw or a circular saw. You can even make a jig at the table saw that will allow your jig to reference the fence, and then you set your board on it, and that gives you a nice jointed edge. All right, so here's where I just jointed. I had the bottom piece of this board against the fence. If I had done these separately, I would have had the top face of this board against the fence and the bottom face of the second board against the fence. I like to do them together like this. Now when I open them up, put them together, I've got a nice flat tabletop that these are on. You can see, nice flat surface on top. So we're gonna go ahead and do this for each joint. I've got 1, 2, 3 more of these to do. right, so we're at the glue up stage. We've done all of our milling, all of our joining. We're ready to finally put this thing together. Now, a couple of important things to remember. If you have done everything right and everything is milled properly, everything's nice and square, flush, lined up, all that jazz, you don't need biscuits or dominoes or dowels or any other kind of aligning feature put into your joints. Now, if you're wondering what that is or what I'm talking about, what some people will do when they make a tabletop, and I do this on occasion as well, is they will take a biscuit joiner or a domino joiner or some dowels, and they will put them into portions of the edge joint. They'll obviously do them at each joint. They'll do, let's say this board is about, 5 feet long. You would put, 3, 4, 5 biscuits, dowels, or dominoes into here. That way, you're referencing off of your top face when you do it, and the idea is that it's going to keep everything aligned during glue up. Well, again, if you did your boards correctly and if you do your glue up correctly and take a few precautions, you don't need them. They're not structural. They're not going to make the tabletop or the panel stronger. All they're doing is aligning things. So if something is way out of whack, and let's say this board comes up and has this huge hump in the middle here, my thought is if I force that thing down and I put dominoes or dowels or whatever, and I use those to force this down, there's obviously tension in the board that I haven't milled correctly, and over time, dowels or not, that tension is going to apply to the rest of the tabletop and it's going to start to warp. The other thing that I've seen is at the end of a table, people will have a board that is sticking up. And so they'll take like a C-clamp or some other sort of small clamp and they will clamp these things together. So let's say this board is kind of, everything's flush here, but then all of a sudden it comes up. They'll have this and they will clamp this thing down together. You're introducing tension into these joints. These, if milled correctly, should be lined up. I mean, as I run my hands over these, I can feel a slight ridge here or there, but nothing crazy, right? So mill your boards correctly and you don't need them. And last but not least, when it comes to these tabletop glue ups, pressure is really important. And as we glue this up, we're going to talk about that. So here I'm getting everything ready. This blue tape is to prevent discoloration of the wood when that black pipe and glue come in contact with it. I'm going to get everything all set up at the correct widths and set up my pipes in the correct area, and then get all of the clamps that I need ready so that everything is at the ready when it's time to start the glue up process. Now, while I'm getting started here, I want to talk a little bit about how much glue you put into these joints. You will see people online having major arguments and debates using words like always, never, your glue up is going to fail, all that kind of stuff. You'll see some people say that you have got to put glue on both sides of the joint. You'll hear some people say it's totally fine to put glue only on one side of the joint. The biggest thing is that you don't want the joint starved of glue, right? So if you are doing your glue ups and you notice you don't get good glue squeeze out, then you're probably not putting enough glue in, right? And you need to put a little bit more glue in your glue ups and your joints here. If you notice that every time you put your joints together and you're gluing your panels up, that glue is pouring out of every single surface and that you've got tons of major insane amounts of cleanup to do afterwards, we're probably putting too much glue in. All I need is enough glue that there is contact fully on all parts of the joint here, and I need enough glue that when I put the clamps on and I put appropriate clamping pressure in, I get a little bit of glue squeeze out. You put enough glue in that you don't starve the joint, but not so much glue that it's dripping out everywhere. You just want a little bit of squeeze out. Now, I am almost positive that I am going to get someone commenting on the video that this is horrible advice, I'm terrible at woodworking, and that all my tables are going to fail. And I don't think that's the case, but let me know what you think. Do you put glue when you're doing these glue ups on both sides, or do you put glue just on one side of the joint? Let me know. All right, so we got a glued edge in every single joint. Now what I'm going to do, push this all together, line it up kind of where I want it to be. A couple of these boards are a little longer than the other. That doesn't matter. We are going to finish this up later. Now, as I start to apply pressure, I'm going to put just enough pressure, and I'm feeling here to make sure that I'm not pushing any of my boards apart. I'm going to put just enough pressure on that I start to get a little bit of squeeze out at each joint. and I am seeing a nice little amount of squeeze out there. Once I see that, I can stop. Now you'll notice on all of these, I'm not cranking down on the pressure, right? I'm not trying to squeeze this as hard as I can. If you feel like your boards have slipped a little bit, I always keep a few of these small clamps handy, and if I feel like my boards have slipped, you can go ahead and loosen up just a little and use that to align them so that they're not sliding past each other. Then apply your pressure. Now what I'm not doing with this is taking boards that are poorly milled and forcing them together. Now, one of the things that you'll see me doing here, I've got good squeeze out all along these joints. I'm going to go ahead and take a clamp and I'm going to put it going in the other direction. And this is something that I first heard from the wood whisperer, Mark Spagnolo. Is it definitely true? I'm not totally sure, but it seems to make sense. The idea is, and I've seen this happen before, because the first tabletop that I ever glued up, I introduced a terrible cup into it during the glue up by using way too much pressure on my clamps, and I only put clamps on the bottom side, and when I came back to that thing, it had bowed up across like this just terribly. So the idea behind this is the squeezing from the bottom is probably going to be forcing your pressure up. The squeezing from these should be putting a little bit of pressure kind of down, and hopefully it balances out so things stay flat during your glue up. Now, like I said, is that 100% true, or is that just kind of a myth? I don't know, could be. It seems to make sense to me, and it seems to work pretty well when I've done it before. I do it with all my panel glue ups. You notice I'm not, as I'm cranking these down, I'm not cranking pressure as hard as I can. I am lightly using finger pressure. Once it gets finger tight, maybe a little quarter turn past that, but not much more. The big thing is I want to be seeing squeeze out. Overall, a nice small amount of squeeze out is what you want. Now, one last little trick of the trade here. We're gonna let this set up for about 20 to 30 minutes. You can see really nice glue squeeze out there. Like I said, that first joint, maybe a little too much glue, but that is just a nice amount of glue squeeze out there. And what we're gonna do is we are gonna come back to this in about 20 minutes with a scraper, and we are going to scrape all this glue off so that we don't have to try to sand it off, and it'll save us a lot of time on the back end. Hey, welcome into the house. So this panel, as you can see, has undergone a bunch of changes since the last time we saw it when we were finishing up our glue up. I've been able to sand it and put finish on it. Now, we're not going to cover that in this video. Those are going to be future Woodworking 101 videos. We're going to go over sanding in depth, and my plan is to hopefully go over some different types of finishes that I've experimented with to share with you guys to let you know how I do those things. So that's it. That's how we put a tabletop together or glue up a panel, all the different things you have to consider. Now, there's a ton of different ways that people do this, and I would love to hear if you do it differently. So if you have questions, comments, concerns, are interested in sharing a different process, leave them down below, as well as any "you're a horrible woodworker for the lack of gluing both sides of a joint" comments. You can leave those too. Hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribed to the channel. Also, if you are interested in seeing future videos in this Woodworking 101 series or any future builds that I've got going, then make sure that you hit that notification bell so that you know when I've got a new video coming. I do a new video every 2 weeks. Now, the next video that we're gonna do is gonna be a fun one. It is gonna be a furniture build. It is a set of end tables. So I can't wait to show you guys how I did those. Thanks for watching, and until next time, get out and enjoy your garage.